So thank you for your interesting conversation and sharing of your story, since this is storytelling. I'm struck by so many things, so I'm going to start with what sounds like a really obvious question. So I know it's obvious if people are thinking, why'd she ask that obvious question? When you put this together and prepared to present it for the first time, who did you envision in the chairs? Who was your intended audience?
You know, it's interesting you asked that. I didn't know it consciously, but I think subconsciously I imagined white folks who aren't comfortable talking about race. I think that was in the back of my mind because people of color, and my wife's going to see this, she hates that expression because she says, I'm white, but I am a color. But people of color talk about these things because we have to. And some white folks do and some white folks don't. And so I was imagining making it easier for those white folks who are reticent to talk about race to have those conversations.
So that's what I thought, because if you were to search through the files of TED Talks, there's like a gazillion talks on race. But you would be likely to stop on yours because it says, What I Learned from My White Grandchildren, which is an arresting title and would draw you into a different kind of story.
Yes.
So I thought to myself, well, okay, so he did that for a reason through the eyes of your white grandchildren. Now, what I think is interesting from your TED Talk to today, I didn't know the whole story of, for example, from watching the TED Talk, of how you became a white grandfather, which for me as a viewer was really critical to understand everything else you said. So I see that you've added that since 2014, and I wanted to ask, why did you put in the details of how you became the white grandfather? I know that's obvious too, but I think it's important.
Well, I'm not sure I gave much detail.
You didn't,
but,
yeah, so
right.
I was curious. Yeah, why, because that seemed to be a decision that you made.
Well, it was adding more material, and that's actually the stories that I wanted to tell, the story of that anonymous relative. I wanted to add that story, and in that story, I have to identify my white wife as part of that. Am I getting it?
Yes,
yes.
But I didn't know until today. You
So
know,
23 years ago, I
yeah.
married Laura. She was white then. She's still white today.
Yeah. I'm guessing.
But when I married her, she had four white children, and those children have given us 10 grandchildren, and 9.5 of them are white as well.
Okay. So 9.5. I'm going to go with that. So you have placed an extreme value on the conversation, mostly aiming at a white audience, but really to open up about something that, as you've described, is really dangerous. People feel it's dangerous to talk about. And I'm wondering if, in preparing to do this, did you think to yourself, or I'm just going to ask, it feels like often when we think about having conversations about race, the burden of initiating the conversation is on the folk of color. Sorry for your wife. You know,
right.
So I'll say African Americans since I'm here. The
Right.
African Americans are people of color, that it must initiate, it must be directed, it must be picked up by the folk of color.
Right.
Which, as someone who's talked about this a lot, I wonder if you'd respond to that.
Well, I would agree with you, and I guess one reason that I wanted to do this talk, even initially, was, again, to make it easier for white folks to identify their own stories and to start telling their own stories. And I hope my stories are both unique enough and universal enough that folks can say, I can relate to that. You know, everyone has race stories. Everybody, and some of them are not pleasant. But what we tend to do, and Jennifer Harvey makes this point in her book, Raising White Kids, is we tend to I don't mean we, I mean some white folks, tend to say we're not going to deal with that. We're not even going to say the word black. We're not noticing racial differences. And I wanted to make it easier
for people to engage in that. So to engage in a conversation, you have to have two halves, in the conversation. And what happens now with folk who have been around for a while and are in the workplace, like many of these people here, for persons of color, is that you get to a certain point and you feel like, I'm okay with Tony Peterson teaching, but I'm tired of teaching. I just want to live my life, and I want to have a reasonable discussion about this as it comes up. But why do I have to, every day of my life, teach you about what this is all about? And I really want someone who has put himself out there to be a teacher around this to address that.
Yeah, it's interesting. You're asking great questions, because it's also interesting that those everyday opportunities are exhausting. But when I did this talk originally as a TED Talk, it was to get it out there and to say it's not that hard. And maybe for me personally, maybe cathartically, it was to put those everyday conversations in perspective. Now I'm going to just go whole hog, because I think I have a niche. I think I have a way that could be helpful for people. And yeah, I still have those everyday conversations. But many of my white grandchildren live in my household. So we have these conversations every day. But they're couched in a personal relationship that we already have that is way beyond race. They are very clear that Peepaw is black and nobody else in our family, in our immediate family, or our household is black. But mainly Peepaw is Peepaw. And they can introduce those conversations. And they, all of my grandchildren who are in school are in multicultural environments in school. Damon plays basketball now. He's 13. I'm missing his last game tonight. But we usually transport his teammates from one, if it's an away game, we transport Damon and 3 of his teammates. One's a white guy, one's a Honduran guy, and one is a African guy. And they talk freely about race because they're of that generation, and because they're in the culture that they're in
what
the school.
What are they saying?
Well, when I say they talk freely, they don't talk seriously and freely. So last time we were driving, one of the boys, we were driving to the game, and we see people, and we see people on the road as we're driving to the game, and they're being silly. They're 13 and 14-year-olds, 12 and 13-year-olds. They're being silly, and they're saying, yelling stuff out to people on the walkway, and then they see someone who actually looks like, ethnically, he could be very related to this African kid. And so one of the white kid, not Damon, said, "Hey, Marty, is that your cousin?" And they laughed. They all laughed because they knew it wasn't just random black guy. It was someone who looked very much like he could be of Martin's family. But they know that that's not a big deal. Again, the relationship covered the difficulty that could be there. So they're more used to talking about those sorts of things than maybe.
So 2 things to unpack from just that story. One is, in your family, because people are living with you, they're all different races, are you the one always having the race conversation? I'd like to know, what kind of conversation about race are the kids having with your wife, with other of the white grandchildren, with themselves? I'd be interested to know what that conversation is about.
I don't know when I'm not there, what those
Just
conversations
wondering if your wife
are.
had reported.
But what
Yeah.
I do know is that my wife is very race conscious. So she would be bringing up those conversations with the kids as well. For the kids, it's only when it matters. Zoe came home from school early in January, and she said, Peepaw, I learned about Martin, Luke, and Chelsea, of course, corrected her and said, it's Martin Luther King. And I said, well, what did you learn about him? And now I'm not remember what she said she learned about him. But she brought that up with me because they're learning it in school. It's, it was right before Martin Luther King Day. And so we had an extended conversation about Martin Luther King and what he actually did, and kids' version, because Martin Luther King is way bigger than the legend, way more complex than the legend.
Yes.
So
I've done documentary about it,
yes,
but let's move
yes.
on. Just to say.
Yes.
So in the car, back to the car just for a moment, with the other kids in the car, what influence can you see directly from your grandchildren with these other kids who are riding in the car? You said the joke was everybody knows, but I'm just curious because in your family you've made it clear that we're relaxed. If it comes up, Peepaw's going to talk about it, Meemaw's going to talk about it, we're going to talk about it.
Right.
And we're going to talk about it in the moment or later.
Right.
And so clearly your grandchildren have a different take on these things and then maybe perhaps their friends do.
What I think has happened as we've been shuttling these boys is it's my car, and they have gotten to know me, and so it's really not channeled through Damon. It's really just the little bit of relationship that I have with them, because we always shuttle the same boys. It's always those three boys. And so, I can't remember a specific conversation we've had, but I know that those boys feel comfortable talking about those sorts of things in our space.
And do they ask you questions sometimes?
No, because it's, those racial things are not a big deal to them. So there might be, it's really on the, not on a very deep level. So no, they're not asking those questions. Maybe if we had a relationship deeper than driving to a ball game, that might be happening.
So one of the things I was struck by on your LinkedIn page, it says people are finally talking openly about race issues. Unfortunately, many of the conversations are unproductive. And so I wanted to question, they are talking about race a lot?
Well,
I'm unaware.
I would say in the past 18 months, people are talking a lot about issues. And like I said, many of those conversations are not productive. We've had Charlottesville, we've had DACA, we've had all these things happen, and so people are talking about race, but people are talking more, expressing more openly their racism.
Okay, so we're on the same page. Is that
yes,
when you say talking,
yes.
I don't see that as a conversation.
No, not as, no,
Yeah,
right.
So, okay.
Right. But so when I did this talk as a TED Talk in 2014, that whole thing about race being violent and overt and obsolete, well, Charlottesville gave us a whole lot there because we saw violent and overt and not obsolete. But we also saw something else that and this concerns me, is we saw folks, white folks, who were able to say with Charlottesville, well, that's not me, so I don't have to talk about race. I can denounce what those folks were doing in Charlottesville, and I'm in the clear. And the problem with that, of course, is racism isn't just overt and violent. Racism isn't just individual. In fact, mostly it's not individual. Mostly it's systemic. And it has to do with, I actually don't like the term white privilege because because it sets folks off, but I think it's a reality. I think when folks hear the word white privilege, some folks misunderstand it, and then the guard goes up. But there is, Michael Emerson likes to talk about those structures that favor some folks over others. He talks about white transparency, where everyone else is ethnic except white folks. And he talks about white normativity, where the white experience is normal and everyone else is different, a variation on the theme. I think with Charlottesville, we did see that overt racism, but I'm afraid it let some other folks off the hook for having race conversations.
Well, a couple things, because we are at Harvard, so the implicit bias test is here with Mazarun Banaji doing that, so we all know we come to the table with some stuff which is easily shown when you take that test, which is free. If people haven't taken it, go take it and see where you are. That's the first thing. The second thing is that Peggy McIntosh of Wellesley has done seminal work about white privilege, in which she couches it in terms that people can understand. If you have not aware of her, then it's unpacking the
invisible
knapsack, in which she asks very specific everyday questions, which have been updated several times. But for example, can you go into a department store and be assured that you will not be followed? So if you can say yes, then that's a privilege. It's a way to articulate the privileges in real life situations, which I think helps in any discussion that we have with white privilege, because that does sound like a concept that people can't get their minds around, particularly if they're feeling, what do you mean I'm not privileged in that way?
And I appreciate you bringing up Peggy McIntosh. I heard her speak 10 years ago in Nashville, and what kind of struck me with her discussion of white privilege is that she started by talking about male privilege.
Yes.
And that really helped me to identify my male privilege. So yeah, I know there's white privilege out there, but I realize now, I realized then that I also have male privilege.
So let's go back to Charlottesville, with people saying to themselves, that's not me, and I could stand up, but you're just pointing out, which I think is true, is that a lot of people maybe didn't want to recognize themselves in some ways. And there is a study that I cannot recall where it's from, which identified that people will do everything not to be called racist. Not to be called racist. Now, their actions can be racist, but just don't call them a racist. So I'd like you to respond to that.
So Michael Emerson has written an article. I'm trying to picture the title, but I can't remember the title. But according to Emerson, every ethnic group has at least one word that is a charged word. It's the N word. There's all these other words for different groups where people have a visceral reaction to that word. And he said, for white folks, the words honky and cracker don't quite fit the bill. They just sound like silly words. He said, I've decided that for white folks, that word is racist. The word racist is the one that gets blood boiling. And I think part of that is because, well, it's an ugly word. We know it's bad. And we reduce racism to, am I a racist or am I not a racist? Was that a racist act or was that not a racist act? And race is so much more complicated than that. I avoid using the word racist as a noun. And I don't even like to use it very much as an adjective, except to describe larger phenomena than was that a racist act or not. The other part of that is intention matters. And so when I say I'm not a racist, I mean, I didn't mean that to be a racist sort of thing. Does that save it from being racist?
No.
Maybe, maybe not.
No. The road to hell, paved with good intentions. Just saying.
Right.
Well, the reason I want to put that on the table because the other part of it, from the black side, and I know that your talk and what you're doing now is really aimed at a white audience, is really important to understand in these conversations, if we're going to have a two-way street conversations, that folks of color, I'll speak for black folk, will go out of their way to identify anything than to call it racist. Oh, maybe they didn't see me in line. Oh yeah, I guess I should have said whatever, or maybe this
Like
is
my relative.
Yeah, something, because you don't want it to be that. Because for it to be that, it is out of your control. People are responding to you for factors that are beyond your control. It had nothing to do with your behavior.
Right.
Right. It's embedded in the system. It's embedded, and that person is coming at it. So that's something that drives me insane when people say, well, that's all they want to do is call something racist. No, we don't. We'd like not to. I'd like you to just be a rude person.
Right. Right.
You know,
Right.
and I know it's disconnected to that.
Well,
you know.
And what I think some folks don't understand is when we call out racism in a situation or race in a situation as a factor in a situation,
Yes.
we're not saying it's the only factor. You may be rude and racist.
Exactly.
You know,
Yeah.
there may be all kinds of sorts of things happening in that particular situation. But to say that race is not a factor, you know, my opinion right now is that if I'm interacting with someone who is not African American, race is a factor in that interaction. Now, it can be a positive factor, it can be a negative factor, it could be mixed factors, but race is there. It's there, and so when black folks see race around every corner, it's not necessarily to say it's the only factor. It's to say, but it is a powerful factor. It is a meaningful factor. And to discount it is ignorant at best. But when you raise that question, I mean, that question raises other questions. So how do we get around that? And I don't know all the answers. I think storytelling is one way to get around it. That's one reason I did this. I thought I was approaching race from a different standpoint than we tend to, which is, am I racist or not? But you know, when we get to that point, both sides tend to shut down. So if we can get around that somehow, that'd be great.
I can recall an instance of a friend of mine. This was a few years ago when these conversations about race were supposed to be, you know, we have these periods that come in ebb and flows. We're now going to have it.
Right.
And so my friends, he lived in Florida, my friend's church, and I always tell this story because I think it's fascinating, they decided we are going to have the conversation about race. He went to a mixed church, and here are the rules. People that sign up, we want everybody to sign up. You may not leave. It's going to get rough in here. You need the space for people to say what they really want to say. That's not happening in the first, the second, the third, or even maybe the fourth time that we meet. But on the fifth time, when it comes out, you have to come back on the sixth. You must commit to being there. And they hung in there for a year. And I said, well, how was it at the end? He said there was a lot more understanding of people. I can't say we walked together kumbaya, but it was really eye-opening because nobody could leave and everyone was committed. And you will agree that in these everyday situations, we're not trying to be committed to go beyond the painful in having these discussions.
Right.
That's where the rub comes. So the conversation never engages because it's a fit and a start around, as you well pointed out, an incident or something happening or whatever in the office or something.
Right. And my mission, my unique mission, as I see it today, is really about the scratching of the surface. Okay. I have plenty of those deeper conversations, but the unique thing that I want to offer is a way to scratch the surface and begin to go deeper. Because if we're really going to change our racialized society, we have to go deeper. But we can't go deeper unless we're scratching the surface. And so that's what I'm doing. I've been in one of those, I was in a workshop also, I guess, about 10 years ago. It was with the United Methodist Church. And they were United Methodist leaders from around the country who gathered for this Embrace, actually it was Abolish Racism seminar, and it was very much as you described. And it did get very heated in that situation. I've taught United Methodist pastors in Tennessee, in Nashville, because they are required to go to a Saturday morning diversity training. And the ones who drag their feet are the white rural pastors who have to come into the big city on a Saturday morning, give away their whole Saturday morning to talk about diversity issues. And they will come in, these pastors, and they will tell you in no uncertain terms, I don't want to be here. I think this is worthless. This is, you know,
I'm not racist.
I'm not racist,
Yeah.
and I'm just here because I can't continue to be a United Methodist pastor unless I come here. And so we work through, it's a 4-hour session, we work through all of that. And inevitably, at the end of the 4 hours, we have people saying, okay, this was not a waste of my time. I'm not where you are, or I'm not where they are, but this was a helpful 4 hours. Now, 4 hours is still only 4 hours.
Right.
But if we can commit to that, and in this case, it was sort of coerced, you know, you have to be there.
Right.
But if we can commit to that, then yes, we can move somewhere.
So you mentioned all the words that, you know, are becoming highly charged or have always been highly charged. One today that I think has become that is identity. And let's put it together with identity politics. Now, all of a sudden, because I'm an African-American person and may have certain focuses and issues that don't concern you, but are important to me, that's somehow racist and narrow-minded.
Right.
But when white people were doing it, it was just fine. Don't let other groups have a focus and have that be identity-focused in some way. I mean, that's the shorthand way of saying it. So I want to put that together with, let me circle back to something you said in your talk, which I will be honest to say, let me think about that. And that's with Elsa and the identity, okay? So you said, your daughter said it's black, it's ugly, and you had to agree that that's not what she looked like. I raised this is going to sound crazy, but let me just put all my stuff out here. So many of us who are not in the majority have worked hard to make sure there are representations of ourselves everywhere because we know we exist in those spaces, or sometimes we just need that reflected back. I have a huge Black Santa collection, and I'll be damned if Megyn Kelly or anybody else tells me Santa not black.
Right.
All right?
Right.
So I had a little issue with you saying, Elsa, I agree, so I want you to unpack that for me.
Well,
you know?
Here's how I unpack it. Elsa is not Santa.
Okay.
And I'm so glad you asked this question because I have this theory about Disney princesses, okay? My theory about Disney princesses is the first ones were all white, and it didn't matter that they were white. They were just white. And then Disney decided, let's have a Pocahontas. Let's have a Mulan. Let's have a
Tiana.
I'm getting to Tiana.
Okay.
So this is my theory about Disney princesses. I think Elsa and Anna were the first really white Disney princesses. So they're not generic white. They're not generic white princesses. They were. I mean, their names are Scandinavian. This setting has to be cold place. Has to be. I think I think it's supposed to be Denmark. I don't remember exactly. It's never in the story. But so when I use Elsa, I see them as very white characters. But Disney has pushed this with Tiana. Now, the original Princess and the Frog story was a Grimm story.
Right.
But what they did is they totally transformed the story and set it in New Orleans and set it with black folks who were ethnically black. They're not just dark skinned. Everything they do is set in that setting, just as Elsa and Anna are set in that other setting. And Disney has figured out, because they're so altruistic.
Yes, they are.
Disney has figured out that you can deal with these universal issues and have specific identities to the characters, like in most great literature. My favorite is the latest that I've seen anyway, which is Moana. And all 5 of my granddaughters, and there 4.5 of them are white, all 5 of them love Moana. And that story of Moana would not fit outside of Polynesia. It would be a completely different story if Moana wasn't a Polynesian girl. But my girls identify with Moana and recognize that Moana is ethnically different from them. So the specificity in the ethnicity is important. And I don't think it would have mattered with Snow White, which ironically, you know.
Yeah, I'll give her that.
Okay.
Yeah, we're cool on Snow White.
But I think for Disney, Elsa and Anna are ethnically white folks. So that's why it fits for me. Plus, I give Chelsea a pass because 5- and 6-year-old kids are just looking at what's right. What is the right Elsa? What is the right Tiana? What is this person supposed to look like? If we had a Black Elsa story, it would probably be a different story.
Well, would then she recognize that that's what she's supposed to look like? I mean,
I
on
don't
the
know.
other side? That's why I'm...
You know, I don't know. I think, you know, she's 10 now, so we'd have a deeper conversation about that now. But at 6 years old, I mean, it's just like you're just learning your colors. You're just learning to identify this is that and this is not that. And Elsa, you know, I've watched this movie. This is not right. This is not what the movie, this is not how the movie goes. Even if they had changed her name and not her color, same thing. It would be, that's not the right character.
This is why you're a teacher and I have no children, because I would have gone a whole different way in that moment, let me just say.
Well, it was really, it's really in that moment, it's because I'm a grandparent and because I've known Chelsea all her life, and she's sitting right there and she feels comfortable enough to say those words to me.
Yes.
Not realizing that people are gonna see her as a racist. I will tell you this. When the TED Talk aired, was available online a few weeks after I actually gave the talk, we had a family viewing. And Chelsea was 7 by then. And she was sitting on the floor, and I was sitting in a chair behind her. And when we got to that point, and she saw people's reactions, you could see her kind of curl up in a ball. Because she picked up that she must have done something wrong. And so I just got down on the floor and I hugged her and I said to her, you didn't do anything wrong. And I tried to explain to her at 7 what was there, and also what was going on there and how people reacted. But I told that story precisely to say, it sounds racist, but it's not. Or she didn't intend it to be. She wasn't saying black skin is ugly. She was saying this particular picture is ugly and it's not Elsa. But I will tell you, as people have viewed this talk, that's the story that most people want to talk about. It's the most difficult one to talk about. And when I was preparing the TED Talk, I was practically finished with the talk before I brought that story out. So I added a little bit more here to sort of flesh it out a little bit.
Which led me to pretty much, I'm coming to my end of my time before you guys get to talk, which is that what pieces of your talk, or what's been the biggest resonance to audiences that you've either heard back through the online TED audience or when you present in other places? I'm curious about what always stands out, and has that changed over time? Because that was 2014.
That was 2014.
And there are many circumstances that have changed, including who we have in the White House, whose take on race is right where we need to be in terms of conversation or something.
Right.
You know?
Well, that story of all the stories is the one that resonates with people and mostly is uncomfortable for people. Some people just like the line where I say race is not real, but it does matter. That line alone shakes people up a little bit. You know, the problem with that sort of slogan is race is, as Andrea said, race is a very complicated word. And I, you know, I had 18 plus minutes to do that talk, and so we can't unpack everything related to race. But that story and that slogan, I think, are the things that people kind of latch onto. And then people like to tell their stories. You know, on YouTube, where people most watch this video, I do read the comments. You know.
I'm scared for you. What are they? Yeah, I deliberately did not read the comments. So.
I do read the comments, but I do because I want to hear those people like to say, thank you for this, here's my story. And I love that. The opportunity people feel like they have to start talking to their children about race. Some people have said, I'm able to do that a little bit now. I know where to start.
So now you've already said, but I have to ask anyway, in a conclusion fashion, is you're not here with the answers about this. You know, you're here to lay something on the table, get people at least stimulated toward thinking about it. But that aside, what solutions do you, some practical solutions for everyday folk who are going to listen to this and say, okay, I can have a conversation in my family about it and with some, but if I want to go beyond that, which is after all what you hope the conversation will be across racial lines, then how should I proceed?
One place I would say, is to get in touch with your own story. There's a documentary that's making the film festival circuit called The Long Shadow. And it's being done by Frances Cossey, who is a white woman from Mississippi. And she is a filmmaker herself, but this is her story. And the story she's telling is of her heritage as a white person. And she actually directs it and also narrates this story. And it travels some of the same ground as 13th, if you've seen that movie.
Mm-hmm.
It's a
and Ava DuVernay.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
So she goes back historically, but it's a personal and social history. And what happened with her is, as an adult, I don't know where the impetus came from, but she wanted to know more about race and her family, and she knows that she has a great-great-great-grandfather or some number of greats, grandfather who was a high-ranking Confederate officer who was actually very active in the work that he was doing. And so she went to, I think, Virginia to learn more about that story. But what she comes across is saying, basically is saying, this is my racist history, and I don't want, I can't erase that, but I want to tell this story because this is my story, and it might be helpful to other folks. And so I think for any of us, and especially white folks who have not done this before, it might even mean just writing down your story of race. Why is it difficult for you to talk about these issues? Why do you not want to talk about these issues if it's difficult for you and if you don't want to talk about it? And start thinking through those things. Michael Emerson, again, he should be paying me. Michael Emerson teaches sociology, and he does a experiment with his students, which I've used in churches as well. And so he says to his students, for the next week, I want you to, whenever you talk about folks, especially white folks, say, my white wife, my white friend, my white children. Always refer to them as in their whiteness. And he says, and then I want you to write a 5-page paper about that experience. And he said, now I know this is an extremely difficult and uncomfortable thing for some of you to do. So if you choose not to do it, then you need to write a paper about why you chose not to do it. And so he does this on a regular basis with his class, multiracial classes. The week is up, they come in to turn in their papers, and they have a discussion. And he says, how many of you did this assignment? And guess what?
What?
All the people of color did this assignment. How many people found this difficult to do? It was only the white folks who found it difficult to do. Because white folks have not been, mostly have not been trained to identify their own ethnicity. It's gray. So, I mean, that's a practical thing that folks could do.
That is.
It's just to take a week and do that, and then reflect on it.
All right. Well, now, that's the end of our time, but your time is open. Now, I like questions.